Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out this morning to hear this dissertation defense. I'm really excited to introduce Joshua Dodds to you and have him get started. My name is Jennifer Culver. I'm the chair for Joshua's committee. And with me on this committee is Dr. Nick Sarveski and Dr. Lori Stevens, who will be here very soon. We're going to be listening to Josh's short presentation where he provides an overview of the work that he's done, and then you'll hear some questions from each of us. So with that, Joshua, take it away.
All right, so my presentation is, my dissertation and presentation is called To Be Neanderthal, 21st Century Humanities-Based Academic Programs, Pluralistic Conceptions of the Human Condition, and New Virtual Realities. But hopefully by the end of this, everyone will be able to sort of explain to someone else what that title means. I sort of designed it that way because I had some people ask me, what does that title mean? So here's a roadmap. This is a lot of words to put on the screen at once, but I just want to kind of get a roadmap together so that we know where we're going. So we have the first section. We're going to talk sort of about the brief history of the sciences and the humanities as they relate to each other, which leads to this idea of the Great Divide, something, just sort of an idea. And then after that, the Great Divide leading to an unrecognized revelation, the revelation being that the human story is not just the story of Homo sapiens. And then we'll go into Neanderthals as kin. This is a nod to, the word kin is a little bit of a nod to a really amazing book by Rebecca Ragg Sykes called Kindred. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you really should check that book out. So I'll go through like a brief history of Neanderthal studies, what I'm calling Neanderthal studies, 1856 to the first discovery, to 2010 when the genome was sequenced and we became aware that we sometimes raised families with Neanderthals. And so that sort of began a new era in Neanderthal studies, you could say, after 2010. And then that will lead us into sort of the culture and cognition of Neanderthal people groups. Sort of surprising when you sort of take everything we know, for now 150 years and you kind of throw it together, it's really surprising what we can now say about culture and cognition in Neanderthal people groups. And that will lead to this idea of our Neanderthal heritage as history, and the idea that eventually this should be talked about in history classes, but it doesn't seem like that's happening, and I think that's going to be very difficult. And so I decided, let's kind of think of a more creative way to infiltrate humanities-based academic programs and find a sort of a subgenre, a newly formed subgenre that will be a little bit more maybe practical to start integrating Neanderthals into humanities-based classrooms without taking on, history departments. And so that is called digital media studies, which is sort of an offshoot of literature studies and cultural studies, where things like poems or books or movies or VR experiences are cultural artifacts that can be studied, and when you study them, you learn more about the culture or the people who made them. And so that leads us to sort of the VR aspect. And then hominid on the holodeck is just sort of a phrase I'm making up to talk about my work and some of the things I've done. And then the impact. So what? So why does this matter? What will it actually end up doing? So let's go to that first section, science and the humanities. This is fairly brief. Just want to, we don't want to go too far into this, but just want to make note that before like in the 1700s, and before, there was a lot more interdisciplinarity in academia in general, and the sciences and the humanities were a lot more connected. There was a lot more movement of scholars between fields, and then right around in the 1800s, during that century, we started to see what historians of the humanities have called like specialization and professionalization, where we have they're looking down a little bit on the interdisciplinary work of their predecessors and really lifting up the highly specialized work of their peers. And so it was necessary, and it was good in a lot of ways. It allowed a lot of disciplines to form and become very rigorous and very scientific and successful. but it was something that, what I'm going to argue, sort of created two different ways to talk about what it means to be human. One example of this sort of professionalization, I think the best for us, is antiquarians become archaeologists. So, sort of before all of this, academics who studied the deep human past, or what they thought was the deep human past, were called antiquarians, not archaeologists, and they studied mostly things like architecture, art, if there was language. So they were looking for like cultural artifacts that they could identify and then trace directly back to the source and talk about the deep human past that way. Then in let's see, I got to make sure one of my notes is don't forget my cards, because I have some extra info on these cards. And so, people are kind of thinking about human history as having been 5, 6, 7, 8,000 years old. And then before that, you had the age of the extinct beasts like mammoths, right? And this is what everyone thought, not just in religious or political circles, but in academic circles. Everyone just assumed that humans did not live with long extinct animals like mammoths. And then in the Vizier Valley, in the Madeline Rock Shelter, a place that I've been, they find in 1864, they find a piece of mammoth ivory, and it was broken up, and they put it together. And when they put it together, they realized this is obviously carved by a human of a mammoth. And so in one, sort of one moment, archaeology was born out of antiquarianism, because people realized, wait a minute, we have way, way, way more to talk about when we want to talk about the beginnings of culture and the beginnings of humans. And so we need to think in totally different ways about the past. And so they started to focus more on things like fossils and stone tools and artifacts like this. And so antiquarianism becomes archaeology. That happens, and we sort of have this divide form, right? The scientific way to study what it means to be human, which is biology and anthropology, archaeology, and then the humanities-based way, history and philosophy, and then literature studies and stuff like that. And so we have this sort of great divide take shape, right? And by the end of by the beginning of the 1900s, that this has been codified. There's anthropology departments in most universities, and so we've got these two discrete approaches to learning more about what it means to be human. And then sort of as we get into the end of the 1900s, we have sort of taking shape another revolution. I mean, a revolution in science that will happen about 2010, and it doesn't get transferred over into the humanities. And so this is a quote, and I'm going to have to, I hope this doesn't interrupt, but I'm going to have to move this little window because it's blocking my presentation. Okay, so the complete absence, this is an excerpt from my dissertation. The complete absence of Neanderthals from humanities-based academic programs is conspicuous because from the moment of their discovery in Southwest Germany in 1856, discussions about Neanderthals have triggered heated academic debates about what it means to be human. And this is interesting to think about, right? We had this idea that right when Neanderthals are discovered, they're immediately sparking these debates about what it means to be human. They didn't last long, but for a few years, there were non-scientists that were very involved in that. So let's move on to talk about, because one of the main goals of this dissertation is to sort of communicate scientific stuff to people who are not normally in these scientific circles. And so it's really important to understand sort of the history of Neanderthal studies. What have academics said and known about Neanderthals from the very beginning? And in order to talk about that, first, let's just say quickly about human evolution. Scientists used to believe that human evolution was very simple, that it was like a river. This is an analogy that they would maybe use, where we start at one point, we get more complicated and more adaptive and better suited, and then we end up at the final point in one continuous stream. And this is the way that in 1860 or 1920, if you had talked to somebody about human evolution, maybe 1950 as well, a lot of people would have said that this was a good way to look at it. Nowadays, what the experts will tell you is we should be thinking about it more like this, right? This is what they call a braided stream, and so this is a really complicated way for these different lines to join, come back together. And this is actually not totally accurate, because some of these, if it were human evolution, would not come back in. They would just end up in dead ends. But we have this very, very complicated web of slightly different types of human beings interacting, sometimes interbreeding, breaking apart, then maybe coming back together again. And so it's this very complicated mixture, which I think really should affect the way we talk about the human condition as humanities, as scholars of the humanities. This is another excerpt from the dissertation, which I think explains this. Modern human beings are a kaleidoscopic amalgamation of ancient human beings, and our cultural and cognitive lives are built on the cultural and cognitive scaffolding they constructed with their blood, sweat, and tears. We do not talk about this in our scientific classrooms enough, and we do not talk about this in our humanities-based classrooms at all. This project represents a first step in learning how to do so. So I do want to emphasize that this project is not an answer to a question as much as it is something that I hope starts conversations that lead to questions that can be answered. So this is, I just want to emphasize, for me, this is a first step. This is something that I understand is new, and 10, 12 years ago, this dissertation would not have been possible. So I do realize that this is new, but I just want to make sure that we're sort of at the forefront of this conversation. So let's talk about the brief history of Neanderthal studies. Like I said, 1856, the first Neanderthal skeleton is identified. There were ones earlier that weren't identified, but this is the first time that scientists said, what is this? And why is it shaped so differently? And if you look, here is the actual skull. They're doing some mining in a quarry, and some of the workers notice these bones that are kind of, broken and in rocks. I don't even know if they would have known that they were human bones, and they just gave them to a local natural historian, and they end up in the hands of a guy named Fulrot, so sometimes these are called the Fulrot or Fulrit fossils, and he notices this is not a Homo sapiens, and he says this actually I think is a different type of human being. You can see, of course, the well-known, large brow ridge, but also there's stuff on the back of the skull, and luckily the skull had enough of the back to where the anatomist could say even the back is different, and it led him to say, hey, look, this is a new type of human being. It was an ancient, extinct type of human being that used to live in our area. This was not a popular thing to say. There was a lot of people that pushed back against this. The most famous a guy, Rudolf Virchow, who was a pathologist, and he looked at these differences. Of course, they were looking at the bones, some of the leg bones and other bones of the skeleton, and he said, no, this is a pathological sapiens. This is a Homo sapiens who just has some sort of disease or injuries that have caused these sort of misshapen bones. So again, right from the start, really, really thoughtful, significant discussions about what does it mean to be a human being, kind of spurred by this discovery of the first Neanderthal skull, 1856, and then fast forward to 1908, the old man of La Chapelle-Saint discovered for the first time, and this is important because for the first time, the people who were involved with that discovery, which they were in the minority, but a few of the people involved with that said, look, we think this guy was buried, right? So everybody's talking about them as ape men and that they can barely walk, and they have no complicated sort of human lives. And then now all of a sudden in 1908, we have somebody come along and say, I think this Neanderthal was buried. Well, that kind of kicks off a lot of discoveries. People are now looking for this. And so what you have is, and also, by the way, the old man of La Chapelle-Saint was found in a place where there was another near complete skeleton. And so what you have is these multiple sites where there's mostly complete Neanderthal skeletons. That's really unusual because when you have an animal that's a large animal, tens and tens and tens of thousands of years ago, you almost never find complete bodies. And then if you do find a complete body, you almost never find more than one. There are some ways that humans can be killed and trapped in caves and rock shelters, like the roof can actually collapse, and this happens, and there's examples of this. But usually when that happens, the bodies have damage that you can kind of tell this has been from a rockfall. So when you find a body that's not damaged from a rockfall, is complete and in multiple sites, it's a really peculiar thing in and of itself. Even if there's no other signs of burial, that's really unusual. And we start to see these all over. 1914, Le Moustier, in the Vizier Valley, we have a second skeleton found. El Cedron in Spain, which they had already found some bones. They went back and looked at them now that they knew of Neanderthals and found, oh, we have another multi Neanderthal site. 1935 in northern Italy, another one. 1939 Tabun Cave in Israel. So we keep having these multiple potential burial sites found, and then the big daddy, 1960 Shanidar Cave in Iraq, in northern Iraq, really, really important Neanderthal site. Forgot to show you this this slide. This is the old man of La Chapelle-Saint. This is sort of a 1909 depiction of what they thought that they looked like. And this is not just some artist who just kind of did this on his own. This was actually titled an accurate reconstruction. So this was what they were selling sort of as scientists to the public of what these people were like. Of course, can't stand upright. He's got the club in his hand. He doesn't look like too nice of a guy. And so, anyways, this is an image that sadly the Neanderthals have still not been able to overcome. And so we get to the famous Shanidar Cave. I think something like 7 to 9 different individual skeletons have been found here in Neanderthals, and they span from 25,000 years apart. So a really important place for Neanderthals, that they would be coming back here for 25,000 years to the same place. Always makes me think of what did Neanderthals think of other Neanderthal fossils if they found them, because maybe that's possible in 20,000 years. But anyways, so here we have Shanidar Cave, and the first skeleton found here was Shanidar 1. They call them Shanidar 1, Shanidar 2 in the order that they're found. And the first one found here, I think, is the most interesting. Maybe the most famous is Shanidar 4, which was the flower burial. The idea that there was a Neanderthal buried with a bunch of flowers underneath him. That's been challenged, and it's kind of up in the air whether or not that's true. But what's not up for debate is this one, Shanidar 1. So this guy is probably the most injured Neanderthal, maybe the most injured ancient human we found. This guy was missing part of his right arm. He had skull fractures on his left side of his skull. He had bone spurs, which made it hard for him to walk. He was probably mostly deaf. So this was a really this was somebody who had been severely injured, maybe more than once, and then recovered and lived for years and years. And there's even indications on the skeleton that he was essentially put back to work, so that he was back integrated into society. This is a really remarkable thing for human groups living 50, 60, 70,000 years ago. It shouldn't be surprising to us, but it was surprising to the people in 1960 when they found this. And what it means is that, you had to have had some sort of a group that was helping him. We would have had to have something to help him survive the initial injuries. Then, of course, getting along in life without the ability to probably collect much food. But, just like in today's human societies, people have lots of different things to offer. And so maybe this guy had something to offer that doesn't save well in the archaeological record, right? So to us, it's a mystery, but to them, this was just an important member of their group, and probably someone that they valued as just a human being, the way we value members of our group. So anyways, that's a really important sort of cognitive discovery. And then another really important cognitive discovery happens in the 90s with the and I don't know how to say this well. I've tried to look it up. Schöningen spears, which is German, and these spears were found, and it's just really remarkable that they were found at all. But they were found in really good condition. This is one of them, and sometimes if they looked closely, they could even see individual carve markings where the creator had made some marks. But what's astonishing is the age. This is 300,000+ years, 300+. So this is early Neanderthals. This is very, very, very long time ago. And these spears are crafted like javelins. And 3 of the 4 spears that they initially found, they are made to a template. They're a small, medium, and large version of the same thing, which means that they're basically making these industrially. And so we have, and also some sort of experimental archaeologists proved that javelin throwers could throw these things with accuracy 120, 150 feet. And so these are probably long-range weapons. And a Neanderthal whose life depended on it could have probably thrown these things really, really accurately. And so, but what this really does is it opens up an entire new world of wood. and other perishable items. So if they had this 300,000 years ago, by the way, just to show you the craftsmanship, the tips of these spears was taken from the root end, so that because that's the hardest wood. So they would make them with that, and they would also put them a little off center so that they were really, really sturdy, which is another way to make them another sort of difficult thing to do, to make it off center, but makes it more strong. Some pieces of wood were fire treated, so they're able to not burn the wood, but just make it stronger by heating it carefully. So anyways, you get this idea that they were masters of woodworking 300,000 years ago. So what else? What other wooden items, will we never know about? It's really compelling, and it's important to remember that just because we can't find them doesn't mean that we should be conceiving our archaeological models and our anthropological conceptions. We shouldn't be conceiving those things without at least acknowledging that there's this large, what some scientists, Linda Hercombe, I think, is called the missing majority. So what else is out there if we have this wooden masterpiece, right? And then we talk about, I want to make sure I mention Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, maybe the first family of Neanderthal studies, the Finlaysons, which is Clive and his wife Geraldine, and then their son Stuart, and all three of them are very important Neanderthal researchers and have done great work. And one of the things that they've proven is an association with Neanderthals and birds, also marine animals. And so again, just this idea that Neanderthals were probably not restricted to hunting up close. If they were regularly able to take lots of different types of birds, that's probably something you need to do from long distance. And then of course with the wood, what other kind of tools did they have that we don't know? And all of this sort of calls to mind. It starts to lead to, why are they collecting bird feathers? It starts to lead to this concept of symbolism in Neanderthal thinking, right? It used to be something that was sort of controversial, but there's just so many examples now that it's difficult to argue that they didn't think symbolically, at least to some degree. We can't say that they thought the same as us, but we do see lots of things that look very human-like. The most incredible is this right here. Actually, I'll build it up because it's a cool story. So this guy, really brave kid, this guy named Bruno, who lived in sort of southeast France, in the 90s. In 1990, or in the 80s, 1990, he's 15 years old, and he finds, after 3 years of digging, so this 15-year-old had spent 3 years digging this tunnel, 100 feet long, to get to this cave that his dad had said, I think there's a cave hidden there, and we need to kind of dig a tunnel to it. And so he digs a tunnel to it for 3 years, crawls through it, and then once he finds the cave and it opens up, he goes 300 meters back, 3 American football fields back into this dark cave. And when he gets back there, he finds this. And this is stalagmites, hundreds of them, that have been snapped off and set in circular, sort of semicircular patterns. And you can see that there's these center piles. Some of those center piles showed signs of repeated fire use. So this is obviously something that animals don't do. That this is a human activity. And they make the discovery. People come in there and scientists look at it, but there's no way to test the dates. And they have some basic ways, and they kind of say, yeah, we think this is at least older than 47,000 years. So maybe it's an Aurignacian site or something like that. Well, fast forward to 2013, and they perform some new tests where they can tell exactly when the stalagmites were snapped off. And when they do that, it comes back at 174,000 years old. 174,000 years old, way earlier than presence of sapiens in these areas. And so immediately, this becomes one of the most important Neanderthal sites in the world, because this clearly is really, really, really interesting behavior in the back of a dark cave. How did they get back to the cave? Why did they do it? So this is just one of the most, I think, important and kind of fascinating sites when it comes to the cognition and the symbolic thinking of Neanderthals. But there are so many. I just want to make a quick run through some of them. 115,000-year-old shells from southeast Spain, a 50,000-year-old piece of string, 3-ply string, 50,000 years ago in southwest France. If they had string, they had rope. If they had rope, there's just so many different things we don't know. 130,000-year-old white eagle talon necklace. There's wear on these teeth, or on these talons, that show that it was worn, and that it was kind of rubbed smooth by being worn. Maybe the most cool or fascinating, a 50,000-year-old wooden tool from Spain. I believe this is not El Soldran. This is Abri Romani. But this is a mold that they poured into a depression. They poured some plaster or something and came out with this replica of a wooden tool that apparently Neanderthals were using 50,000 years ago. There's many examples of this sort of what looks like tally marks or counting. This is on a hyena bone 60,000 years ago. And so anyways, we sort of moved to a new era in Neanderthal studies, right? Where now we conceive of Neanderthals instead of the way that that he was depicted. They were depicted with that hunched over hairy body. This is now how scientists imagine Neanderthals. This is actually from a real discovery in Siberia. It was a teenage girl and her father, and they proved their relationship by DNA. And this is one of my very favorite artists. You can see his name in the lower right. Hopefully, it's Tom Bjorklund, or I'm not sure how to say it, but anyways, this guy is really kind of a visionary to me. He's got other types, not just Neanderthals, but other types of ancient paintings that I think really humanize these ancient people in a way that's really important. But I just love this picture with him holding her foot, her looking off in the distance. Just a really amazing thing. And really, we've come a long way when you think about what we know about how these people lived. I mean, so this is really mind-blowing to me. This is from that book I mentioned. But just do this with me for a second. Try a thought experiment. What if we'd only found the first Neanderthal in 2010 with the genetic tools to immediately see where we fitted together? They would have been known from the start as a branch of the family tree we were only temporarily separated from, and at the same time, our 1,000 times great-grandparents. What would they have been called? I just love that. What would they have been called? So if you're going to attack an empire, right, like we're going to try to do something, we're going to try to change a little bit about the way that humanities programs think about the past. Well, that's a sort of like taking on an empire. And if you're going to take on an empire, you don't want to go at the biggest castle with the tallest walls directly head on. What you want to do is you want to find a newly built outpost that doesn't have much defenses yet, and you want to kind of infiltrate there to kind of work your way into that empire. And so that's the method that I'm taking by sort of sidestepping for now and pushing to future research the idea of Neanderthal heritage as history, and moving to that new field I mentioned, digital media studies, which is where we get to VR. And so the main thing to note at first is just that virtual reality from the very beginning, this is 1960 on the left of Ivan Sutherland and his Sword of Damocles, which they call it the Sword of Damocles because you had this huge metal machine hanging above you. And so this is 1960, early 1960s at MIT. It's like one of the very first head-mounted display VR systems. And so I just want to make the point that we think of VR as something that's like an entertainment, thing, or based on movies and all that stuff. But really, VR from the very beginning was a research tool at universities, in university labs, to learn more about our world and us. And so I just want to make sure that we remember that I'm sort of arguing that virtual reality needs to return a little bit to its roots and be welcomed in more and more and more and more university settings, and not just universities that are technology forward. I think that we're at a place now, and the picture on the right, I mean, that headset is, I think, under $1,000, and you can get ones today that are maybe even better than that for under $500. And so it's much, much, much more affordable than it's ever been, and it's much more important than it's ever been. We're learning all the time about how virtual reality improves educational outcomes. I write about that in the dissertation. It also improves empathy and the ability to connect with other people, especially, this is the connection to Neanderthals, especially lost people groups of the past, or underrepresented people groups of the past. This is a unique way for us to meet Neanderthals, right? And so I just want to remind everyone that we should be looking, I think, at the early part of the 20th century as a revolution in virtual reality as well. Virtual reality has become cheap and affordable, and for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, any university could put together a program and start putting together projects with poets, with art historians, with psychologists, with literature studies people, with history professors. So this is sort of my second push for the second revolution. And then we have two of my favorite sort of demonstrations that I think give a little bit of a model that we could follow as humanities scholars trying to integrate Neanderthals into our classrooms and coming up with VR experiences that take advantage of like well-established methodologies. Well, clouds over Sidra, very famous. One of the very first VR experiences that became kind of popular across the world. And this is also the first VR experience made for the UN. Was partially responsible for raising something like $2 billion for Syrian refugees in these refugee camps, but just does a really good job, I think, of showing us underrepresented people groups. And then another one that's just amazing called The Key. This is a more recent VR experience, I think 2016. And this one, I think, really is focused on helping us experience what I call unmourned losses. Right, so sometimes you're not mourning something because you didn't know you lost it, and that's one of the things that this VR experience talks about. And I think that's a good way for us to think about VR and Neanderthals. Right, it's a way for us to sort of maybe learn about some unmourned losses that happened a long time ago. But just because they happened a long time ago, it doesn't mean they're not a part of our story. And so what have I been doing about this, and how do I bring all this together? What are some ways that we can sort of converge on something that meets the real world? And about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I started working all this kind of stuff. And I ended up coming up with a conference called Virtual Reality and Being Human. And we conducted this at SMU last year. It was really great. We had Dr. Merlin Donald, who I write about a lot in my paper, Dr. Culver, of course, my chair, and then Dr. Matthew Boulanger, an archaeologist at SMU. We had these three speakers, and we had tacos, and the crowd would come out and talk during the breaks. And so just wanted to sort of start conversations about this kind of stuff and getting people who don't normally have conversations to talk, people who are interested in anthropology and archaeology and VR creation community type people. Those are the two crowds I was trying to unite. It was really successful. This is a picture I took of a Neanderthal model in Spain, and I had somebody put a headset on him, and then a picture of the conference itself. And I hope this is only the beginning of stuff like that. And so we're getting to the end here, and I just want to talk about some future research that I see and that I sort of intended to come about from this. The first one is the idea, like I said, the big one, maybe the something that maybe is a multi-dissertation project and maybe a several years type of project, but learning how to teach our Neanderthal heritage as history in our history classes. Augmented reality.
Come on in. Hello. Do you have your book? Yeah.
Okay,
Awesome. There's the quiz. Your phone.
Somebody could mute their thing. Somebody started talking. But anyways, augmented reality as an archaeological tool. This is augmented reality is where we sort of combine virtual reality graphics with the real world, so overlaying the virtual reality on top of the real world. I just think that that's got to have some applications in archaeology, and we can maybe make some discoveries that aren't possible in other ways. This is the craziest idea, but maybe my favorite. This idea that in the far future, maybe virtual reality will develop to the point, and our knowledge of Neanderthals will develop to the point where we could almost study them ethnographically inside of VR. We could build these very complicated environments. We would have to know the environments of these places very well. Insects, birds, vegetation, if there's aquatic life, water systems. But if we could recreate these environments and make them function in a way that represents the real world, and then we could take Neanderthal people groups and sort of insert them into that environment, and almost like a computer model, we could twist the knobs and run it 1 million times or 10 million times, twisting the knobs each time and changing things about the Neanderthal society, and see if at some point we can get those virtual Neanderthal groups to produce archaeological results that match what we see in the real world. Maybe we can actually get this VR model to match what we find in the real world. Probably very maybe it's a pipe dream, but I just think it's a cool idea. And then Merlin Donald, Dr. Donald has been doing really good work with evolutionary psychology for a while. I think that because virtual reality lets you assume the consciousness of someone else, you get inside of the eyeballs of someone else in VR. I think that might be something that could be used in that way. How is prehistory? This kind of relates to the first bullet point. How is prehistory addressed in compulsory history classes? Then I've done some teaching with the young children. I love Montessori method and all that kind of stuff. And so I have thought, how is prehistory addressed in preschools, and how could that be done in the future? And then the last thing, just some ancillary impact, some things that I'm not sure that I intended, but looking back, I think that this would what would actually happen. One thing, anthropology and archaeology would need to have a larger role in humanities-based academic programs in general. I mean, I think this is separate from my entire dissertation. You could make this whole point separately. But I just really think that that's important going forward. And then, like I've already said, virtual reality needs a larger role in humanities-based academic programs. It would mean shifting scales of study in history classes. It would mean that historians and history professors would need to become comfortable talking about things in their classrooms that happened farther back than 5,000 years ago, or maybe 10,000, 12,000 years ago, which seems to be the limit of when people will talk about the past in history classes. And then this is a complicated point that I talk about a lot in my paper, but the ancient DNA revolution, which allowed us to sequence the DNA of Neanderthals, also revealed that there's some what they call non-trivial genetic differences between population groups and modern people, which just means that by looking at somebody's DNA, you might find ancient markers that affect their health and their sort of life today. And if we're not careful, people could take this information, misconstrue it, and form like a pseudoscientific argument for racist or prejudiced ideas. But we can cut that off at the knees by talking about it first and making sure that everyone understands what it means before it can be misunderstood. And then I think this is maybe the most important point for me. Promote pluralistic conceptions of the human condition. There's never been only one way to be human. And I think as humanities scholars, we need to recognize that. And I think we need to kind of start there before we do anything else. And so I just want to finish this. Thank y'all for listening so much. I want to finish this with these are the actual last words of my dissertation, these last few sentences. So I'll just end with this. The more we learn about Neanderthals, the more we learn about ourselves. And it's time that as scholars of the humanities, we recognize the part they played in the human story. Doing so opens up entirely new intellectual landscapes and horizons to scholars of the humanities in the future. We just have to have the courage to put on a VR headset and go find them. Thank you. I'll quickly flash my sources so that everyone knows it's legit. But thank y'all very much.